The Red Ball Express was an unparalleled emergency logistical undertaking, hastily established by the Allied forces to sustain the momentum of the rapidly advancing armies pushing east across France, following the highly successful Operation Cobra breakout in late July 1944. Before the activation of the Red Ball, the Allied forces faced a devastating logistical crisis. Supply lines were severely hampered by the systematic destruction of French ports and railways by intense Allied bombing raids prior to the invasion, coupled with the methodical German scorched earth tactics during their retreat. This critical logistical bottleneck meant that the fast-moving armored divisions, spearheaded by the highly aggressive Patton's Third Army, were constantly on the verge of stalling due to crippling shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. The Red Ball was an extraordinary improvisation born of this absolute necessity, meticulously designed to move an astonishing volume of cargo, aiming for over 12,500 tons of supplies daily, transporting this material from the disembarkation ports in Normandy to the front lines, a grueling and often hazardous distance that eventually stretched up to 400 miles, over 640 kilometers. The official commencement of this vital operation was strategically set for August 25, 1944, coinciding with the momentous liberation of Paris, marking the shift from consolidating a beachhead to rapid continental advance. The Red Ball Express ran for a crucial period until November 16, 1944, when the successful capture and operational repair of the deep water port of Antwerp allowed the Allies to establish a shorter, more sustainable sea route for supply. The entire operation was professionally managed by the Transportation Corps of the U.S. Army, specifically its specialized motor transport brigades. The distinctive name originated from the prominent red circles, red balls, marked on the front grille and fenders of the trucks, coupled with the special, highly visible route markers placed along the dedicated highways, which signified absolute priority and clearance for high-speed movement. This priority designation system was, in fact, an adaptation borrowed from American railroad terminology used traditionally for express, high-priority freight movements. The entire logistical architecture of the operation was ingeniously organized into a strictly enforced one-way loop system to maximize throughput efficiency, maintain high speed, and crucially, minimize the risk of devastating head-on collisions across the narrow French roads. Two main arteries, spanning hundreds of miles, were meticulously established. The northern route was dedicated exclusively to carrying fully loaded supplies east from the major logistical depots toward the ever-shifting front lines, while the southern route was used solely to carry the convoys of empty trucks west back to the ports of origin for immediate reloading. These routes were designated exclusively for the Red Ball convoys, allowing them to bypass slower, regular military and civilian traffic and travel at continuous high speeds. This dedicated non-stop flow, often utilizing both lanes of the highway, was absolutely essential for overcoming the critical lack of functioning French railways. The personnel of the Red Ball Express were the truly indispensable, yet often overlooked, component of the entire operation. It is a critical historical fact that over 75 of the drivers were African-American soldiers drawn from segregated quartermaster truck companies of the U.S. Army, including units like the 397th and 398th. These soldiers, systematically barred from serving in frontline combat roles due to the deeply entrenched racist policies of the era, were instead assigned to this grueling, intensely dangerous, and unequivocally essential logistical duty. Their unwavering dedication and physical commitment, often requiring them to drive 18 to 20 continuous hours a day through darkness, near combat zones, and profound fatigue, was the very physical engine that kept the Allied armies moving forward with unprecedented speed and force. The workhorse vehicle of the Red Ball Express was the ubiquitous, rugged, and highly dependable GMC CCKW2 Frac 1-2 ton 6x6 truck, universally and affectionately known by the drivers as the Deuce and a Half. The Army eventually deployed an astonishing fleet of approximately 6,000 of these trucks, operating in continuous non-stop convoys. These vehicles were favored for their mechanical simplicity, inherent reliability, and capability of hauling up to 5,000 pounds, over 2.2 metric tons, of diverse cargo over rough, bomb-damaged terrain. However, maintaining such a massive, continuously used fleet was a constant, crippling challenge, forcing drivers and mechanics alike to often resort to the desperate tactic of cannibalizing disabled vehicles abandoned along the route to scavenge essential parts to keep their own trucks operational. Operation Fuel First became the absolute top priority of the Red Ball Express. In the initial crucial phase of the breakout, the severe lack of petroleum, oil, and lubricants, POL, was recognized as the single biggest, potentially campaign-ending limiting factor on the rapid armored thrust. Consequently, dedicated convoys carrying hundreds of thousands of 5-gallon jerrycans of high-octane gasoline were designated as the most urgent cargo. At the peak of the operation, the Red Ball was single-handedly responsible for transporting over 500,000 gallons of gasoline daily. The fuel priority was so intensely high that drivers were often given explicit, urgent orders to dump non-essential cargo, such as food or certain types of ammunition, if their truck or its capacity was needed immediately for a critical fuel run to a forward supply dump. The drivers faced immense and debilitating physical and psychological fatigue throughout the operation. The standard operating procedure demanded continuous, high-intensity driving, often in long, unyielding convoys of 25 trucks or more, under conditions of minimal or non-existent sleep. Drivers were constantly forced to battle severe exhaustion, the profound danger of sleep driving, and relentless exposure to the harsh elements in their open-cab trucks as the operation continued through the transitional autumn weather. This constant fatigue became a major, unavoidable cause of accidents, which frequently led to severe injuries, the catastrophic loss of vital supplies, and the destruction of the valuable trucks. The sheer, sustained physical commitment demanded of these predominantly segregated units remains a testament to their extraordinary endurance. Combat zone risks were not an occasional hazard, but a constant, brutal reality for the Red Ball drivers. As the front line aggressively advanced deep into France, the designated Red Ball routes frequently ran through areas that had only been recently cleared of German resistance or dangerously close to pockets of bypassed enemy forces and snipers. Convoys were constantly at risk of being targeted by German snipers, sporadic small arms fire, and occasionally coordinated ambush attacks, especially when traveling under the cover of darkness. Furthermore, drivers had to perpetually contend with the hidden hazards of German landmines and unexploded ordnance scattered along the shoulders of the dedicated, congested roads. The sheer maintenance challenge involved in sustaining the Red Ball was immense and nearly overwhelming. The relentless, rigorous pace, coupled with the persistent overloading of the trucks, led to extremely high rates of mechanical breakdown and vehicle failure across the entire fleet. Each truck often covered distances far exceeding the typical operational life cycle for wartime logistics, accumulating wear and tear at an alarming rate. Specialized mechanized maintenance crews, often working in primitive conditions, worked literally around the clock at designated depots, but the relentless demand for critical spare parts, particularly heavy-duty tires, transmission components, and replacement engines, frequently and dangerously exceeded the available supply, placing huge responsibility on the drivers to perform emergency roadside repairs. Racial tensions and institutional discrimination tragically plagued the operation, despite its undisputed, critical function to the Allied victory. The vast majority of African American drivers and support personnel lived and worked under the harsh, debilitating strictures of the U.S. Army's deeply entrenched segregation rules. They were systematically given the oldest, most worn-out equipment and consistently received inadequate support facilities, mess privileges, and medical care compared to their white counterparts. Despite performing this essential, highly dangerous logistical duty with extraordinary competence, they routinely faced contempt, open prejudice, and professional disrespect from many white officers and soldiers, highlighting the persistent and morally corrosive injustice within the military structure of the time. The level of logistical improvisation and unconventional resourcing required to successfully run the Red Ball was phenomenal and speaks to the desperation of the situation. To meet the massive, often unmet tonnage goals, the army ruthlessly pressed virtually every available civilian vehicle in France into service, including large numbers of captured German trucks and even requisitioned French civilian lorries. The sheer coordination required of personnel, wildly diverse vehicles, and varied cargo across hundreds of miles of broken infrastructure and often hostile territory was a logistical masterpiece of military planning, executed under almost unimaginable pressure and time constraints. The typical Red Ball convoy structure and discipline was rigorously enforced. Convoys usually consisted of a minimum of 25 trucks, spaced precisely 60 yards apart for safety and visibility, and were invariably led by a jeep carrying a convoy commander. They traveled in continuous motion for hours on end, halting only for pre-scheduled driver changes, essential refueling, or mandatory security checks. Strict speed limits were nominally imposed, usually 35 mph, to maintain operational cohesion and prevent mechanical failure, although exhausted drivers frequently exceeded these limits out of professional urgency and pressure to deliver. Security and traffic control along the vital artery were the direct responsibility of the military police, MP, who were strategically stationed along the entire route. The MPs were granted absolute authority to enforce the dedicated one-way system, ensuring that absolutely no civilian or unauthorized non-Red Ball military traffic interfered with the crucial flow. This tight, enforced control was vital for maintaining the high-speed operation, though instances of petty looting, civilian attempts to access the route, and unauthorized pilfering of supplies were occasionally reported and severely dealt with. The operation's initial and long-term success was directly tied to the supply depot established at the liberated port of Cherbourg. When the port was captured, it was found to be deliberately and comprehensively destroyed by the retreating Germans, leaving a massive wreck. American combat engineers rapidly and heroically repaired the docks and harbor facilities, transforming Cherbourg into the main, high-volume receiving point for materiel. The incoming supplies were then quickly organized, meticulously sorted, and immediately dispatched in the long-haul convoys from major staging areas near the port, marking the critical starting point of the long, grueling haul. Ammunition was the second most crucial and urgently needed cargo after fuel. The lightning-fast Allied advance across France involved the massive, sustained consumption of artillery shells and small arms rounds, far exceeding pre-invasion estimates. Red Ball trucks dedicated to hauling ammunition were highly volatile and particularly high-risk targets for German attack. Ensuring a constant, uninterrupted flow of shells and ordnance allowed the Allied artillery units to maintain the devastating, sustained barrages needed to crack and break German defensive resistance. Personal heroism, self-reliance, and driver initiative were daily, indispensable occurrences among the drivers. Many African-American drivers showed extraordinary resourcefulness, deep personal bravery, and profound determination that went far beyond the call of duty. Stories abound of drivers ignoring crippling fatigue and performing essential repairs on their vehicles under sporadic enemy fire, risking their lives to ensure the delivery of critical supplies. This initiative was often driven by a deep personal commitment to proving their competence and contributing decisively to the war effort, despite the constant systemic racial discrimination they faced. Their willingness to transcend the strictures of a racist system and become the most reliable logistical lifeline, underscored a quiet, fierce devotion to the mission. The Red Ball Express's ultimate strategic impact was undeniable and absolutely pivotal to the Continental Campaign. It conclusively demonstrated that the immense American industrial capacity, successfully translated into flexible vehicular logistics, could fundamentally outpace and overwhelm the German capacity to effectively defend the continent against a mechanized advance. By moving high volumes of critical cargo over road networks that had previously been considered inadequate, the Red Ball operation effectively eliminated the critical logistical barrier that had threatened to stall the entire Allied invasion. This directly enabled the rapid liberation of vast portions of France, and most critically, allowed the rapidly advancing armies to close decisively on the German border before the Wehrmacht could establish a stable, fortified defensive line. The severe shortage of tires rapidly escalated into a critical operational vulnerability that plagued the entire operation. The combination of heavy, sustained loads, the enforced high speeds required to meet daily quotas, and the abrasive nature of the poor, often bomb-damaged French road surfaces caused truck tires to wear out at an alarming and completely unsustainable rate. The demand for replacement tires often significantly outstripped the factory output back in the US, forcing the Army to resort to stringent conservation measures, tire rationing, and increasing the already crushing maintenance burden on the exhausted mechanics who had to repair and recap damaged or worn tires. This continuous need for tires was a perpetual headache that threatened to grind the convoys to a halt. German counterattacks and the threat of encirclement posed a particular violent risk during the late stages of the Red Ball's operational life, and its methodology was revisited dramatically during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Although the core Red Ball operation had officially shut down, the spirit, priority, and methodology of the Express, utilizing dedicated prioritized road networks and extreme emergency priorities, was immediately and rapidly revived and implemented. This emergency logistics effort was crucial for rushing critical fuel, ammunition, and desperately needed winter gear to the American forces besieged in the Ardennes, decisively proving the enduring strategic value and adaptability of the dedicated high-speed supply concept, even after the main campaign had ended. Communication and navigation over the vast, often unfamiliar, and quickly changing routes were continuous and major challenges for the thousands of young drivers. They relied heavily on the highly visible, prominent red ball markers painted on buildings and signposts, clear, hastily erected road signs, and the explicit direction of the military police traffic controllers, as official French maps were often outdated, unreliable, and radio communication was not always feasible between the long, fast-moving convoys. The immense responsibility placed on the drivers for self-reliance and the effectiveness of the MP traffic control were absolutely key to avoiding major navigational errors, which could have catastrophically disrupted the crucial supply flow for entire armies. The strategic success of the Red Ball Express was fundamentally dependent on the rapid and efficient establishment of forward resupply and maintenance depots, strategically placed at intervals along the long, demanding route. These vital depots, which were often little more than temporary tent cities, provided the exhausted drivers with hot meals, minimal mandatory rest periods, often just a few necessary hours of sleep, basic emergency medical aid, and, crucially, the necessary parts for emergency mechanical repairs. By providing these essential services, the depots allowed the convoys to minimize operational downtime and rapidly turn around for the return trip west, maximizing the total delivery cycle and ensuring the continuous throughput of the critical cargo. The massive undertaking eventually included over 140 separate truck companies and utilized nearly 23,000 drivers by the time of its closure, demonstrating the staggering organizational and manpower effort required to achieve its goals. The sheer, unprecedented scale of manpower, vehicles, and fuel dedicated to this temporary but vital supply effort underscores the magnitude of the logistical problem posed by the swift, unanticipated advance across the entire breadth of France. The organization of such a diverse and complex array of segregated units into a cohesive, non-stop operation represented a monumental, centralized achievement that few militaries in history could have duplicated. The decision to officially disband the Red Ball Express in mid-November 1944 was a clear and positive sign of logistical victory for the Allied forces. The successful capture and operational repair of major French and Belgian ports, especially the vital deep water port of Antwerp, coupled with the significant repair of key railway lines, meant that the reliance on the long, grueling, truck-intensive haul was finally over. With the introduction of the shorter sea routes and rail transport, the Allied supply lines became shorter, safer, and significantly more fuel-efficient, allowing the logistics burden to be reliably transitioned back to the highly efficient military rail system, confirming the success of the truck-based improvisation. Despite their immense sacrifices, demonstrable competence, and dedication, the critical contributions of the African-American drivers were regrettably often minimized, marginalized, or completely ignored in official military histories and post-war commendations immediately following the war due to pervasive racism within the U.S. establishment and broader American society. Their story remains absolutely central to the operation's success. Without them, the Red Ball would have failed, but their heroic efforts were only fully and officially recognized decades later, highlighting a complex, painful, and deeply unjust aspect of American military history during the decisive moments of World War II. In total, the Red Ball Express delivered an astonishing non-stop volume of over 412,000 tons of vital cargo during its intense 83 days of continuous operation. This sustained, non-stop flow of materiel from the beaches to the distant battlefield was the singular, indispensable achievement that prevented the momentum of the entire Allied push from stalling and collapsing into a logistical quagmire. The Red Ball transformed a catastrophic potential logistical crisis into an insurmountable strategic advantage that decisively closed the distance to the German border, directly enabling the ultimate success of the Western Allied advance.